Hi guys, Chicken and I are going to read you Children of the Longhouse, Chapter 6 today. Chapter 6, The Night Alone. The first two times during the night when Okwari woke up, he tried to reach under what he thought was his usual bed to find the elm bark box in which he kept his stone. That stone had in it two big, beautiful crystals, each as big as a man's thumb. It was his favorite possession, and he sometimes took it out in the night to hold it above him and watch the light from their central fire flicker and reflect from its facets. He realized now that reaching for that elm bark box was probably something he did every night. I will not wake up again, he said to himself after that second time, but he was wrong. He had hardly drifted off to sleep when the sound of scratching against his little lodge made him sit bolt upright. There was still some light from the flicker of his small fire, and when he leaned his head close enough to his door to look through the cracks, he saw two little shadows poking about. One of them made a churring sound, and the other one chirped and growled in reply. Raccoons. He should have known that they would come. Of all the animals in the forest, none were more curious. One of the raccoons poked its nose right against the side of the lodge and began to climb up on it. Whew! Cried Aquari, making the sound of the horned owl. The raccoon jumped down and disappeared as fast as a deerskin ball scooped up by the taquarathon stick. Its companion scooted away almost as quickly. Aquari laughed silently as he listened to the sound of the two raccoons scurrying away through the dry oak leaves. The next time he woke was when he had heard a strange sound. It was like the sound of regular footsteps. He listened and listened. An owl had been calling earlier, but now that sound was gone. From the other side of the great hills, the lonely unanswered call of a wolf had drifted to him once during the night, but that wolf had called only once. Even the wind, which had whispered its familiar song through the maple and oak leaves, was now holding its breath. Everything was completely silent. Aquari listened and listened. He began to realize that he was listening for things he could not hear. The small fire he had made in front of his new lodge had burned out long ago, and so he could not hear the sound of it burning. Back in the big longhouse, there was always the sound at night of the fires. Their hissing and crackling and popping noises were as familiar and reassuring as the nearby sounds of breathing from his family. At night, in the big longhouse, he could always hear the sounds other humans make. He heard their yawns and their sighs. He heard the creaking of sleeping benches and the thump of hands or feet against the sides of the lodge when someone rolled over. He heard the sound of people when they woke and whispered to each other and laughed in a soft, knowing way. He heard the ones who woke and got up to place more wood on the fire in the winter when it grew quite cold before the dawn. He heard those others who woke when it was so warm in the summer that they would take a deerskin robe with them and go sleep outside near the longhouse wall. He heard the coughing that was so common in the late winter, especially on moist days when the smoke from the fires did not rise through the smoke holes but flowed around within the longhouse like a dry, gray river. Those sounds filled every night, and the night was strangely quiet without them. But there had still been that sound. Aquari listened and listened. He could hear his own breathing, but that was not it. He listened further. Blump, 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 blump. It was like the two-step beat of the water drum. Then he knew what it was. He was hearing the sound of his own heart beating. The last time he woke, just before the dawn light, was when the light from outside his lodge grew so bright that he thought surely it was dawn. It was so bright that he pushed open the woven door he had propped in place and crawled out. There, looking down from the sky, was Grandmother Moon. Her full round face seemed as warm and caring as the face of his own grandmother. Her silver light made the river below him shimmer and gleam like a string of pale wampum beads. Wampum. It was so bright that he could make out the shapes of the big Longhouse and the other smaller buildings of his own village on the far side of the river. Macquarie stood and lifted his hands toward the moon. "Grandmother," he said, "thank you for coming to visit me when I was feeling so lonely. You have reminded me what my grandmother taught me. Wherever I go, I will never truly be alone." The light from the bright face of elder brother, the sun, shone between the woven branches of the rough lodge door. Macquarie opened his eyes as those first rays of dawn touched his face. He felt cold and stiff. He had missed being able to stretch out to his full length, for his small round lodge was only big enough for him to lie curled up on the earth like a sleeping chipmunk. He lay there, breathing slowly, thinking about the night he had just passed. As Macquarie walked down the hill toward the river, it seemed to him he could hear and see things better this morning than he ever could before. He was just a little tired from his wakeful night, but that night alone and going without a meal had sharpened his senses. "It is just as my Uncle Big Tree told me," Macquarie said to himself as he stopped to look at a beech leaf, seeing it as if for the first time how its notched edges glittered in the sun, feeling with a finger the toughness of the leaf. You are able to see better and hear better when you go without food for a time. He remembered the story Big Tree told of the two young men who were always competing with each other. They both belonged to the Turtle Clan, and so they were very stubborn. After they had both fasted for some days, one tried to outdo the other with what he could see and hear. "I can see the farthest hill," said the first man. "Can you see it?" "Yes, I can also see the tallest pine tree on top of that forest hill," said the second. "Can you see that?" "Indeed I can," answered the first, "and I can see the highest branch on top of that tree." "Ah," said the second man, "then can you see the butterfly resting on the top of the smallest twig on that highest branch?" "Of course," said the first man. "I am now counting how many spots there are on its wings," said the second. "There are 6 on each wing," said the second man. "But listen, I can hear that butterfly's wings as they flap," said the first man. "Ah," said the first. "Ah," said the first man, "I can hear that too, but I also hear the butterfly breathing. Can you?" But the two young men never finished their discussion, for at that moment their two mothers, who had walked up unheard behind them, each poured a cup of water onto the heads of their sons. They were so busy arguing about what they could see and hear that they couldn't really see and hear, that they didn't see and hear what was about to happen to them. Oh, anyways, okay. Now, as Macquarie walked, he began to hear a noise. It was a sound like an animal growling. He stopped and listened more closely, trying to figure out from where that sound came. It did not take him long, for the sound came from his own stomach. It was growling with hunger. Macquarie patted his stomach. "I am sorry," he said. "You are complaining because I have neglected you, my stomach. I left home without bringing any food with me. Now we will have to wait until I have crossed the river. But try to be quiet, my friend. A bear might hear you and think that you are another bear calling to him." Macquarie smiled as he remembered how his father, Two Ideas, had explained to him the way bears talk to each other. They had been walking in the woods for a long time, and Macquarie's stomach had also been reminding him that it was past the time to eat. They growl like your stomach does, my son," he said to Macquarie. His father was not always available to do things Macquarie, for the younger sister of Two Ideas had several children, a son and 2 daughters. As a good uncle, Two Ideas had as much responsibility for helping with the upbringing of his sister's children as with the children of his wife. Thus, Two Ideas spent a good part of almost every day in the small Turtle Clan Longhouse, built just a spear's throw to the north of the great Longhouse of the Bear Clan. Macquarie did not mind. It was the way things were supposed to be. After all, his father and he were of 2 different clans, And it was that way with every father and son amongst the Longhouse people. You always had to marry someone of a different clan. That happened, as was right and proper, when a man's mother agreed with the mother of that man's future wife that the two young people should be allowed to marry. Oh, chicken, you left this shot. Oh well. After the marriage, the man would go and move into the longhouse of his wife's clan, and all the children would belong to the clan of their mother. O'Quarry liked his father very much, and so he was glad that the longhouse where his father's nephew and two nieces lived was right next to their own. After all, his father would have been away much more often, going to teach things to his nephew, and his father had much to teach. For one, O'Quarry's father was among the best hunters in their village. It was sometimes said that no one knew more about the ways of the animals than did Two Ideas. As they walked that day in the forest, Two Ideas had talked to O'Quarry about the bears. You must always show them respect, he said, especially a mother bear who has cubs. Remember what happened to Grabber. It was hard for O'Quarry not to laugh out loud when he thought of how Grabber got his nickname. As a young man, Grabber had thought very highly of himself. He wanted everyone to call him by a different name than the one that had been given by the midwife when he was born. He wanted to be known as Walks with the Bears. He had even taken the time and trouble to make a tattoo on his thigh that would stand for his name. He took a long time pricking his legs with the bone awl and then rubbing in wood ashes to make his tattoo. Most of the people had tattoos of one kind or another. Rubbing the wood ash made the tattoos a beautiful blue color. But most people either had simple tattoos, lines, circles, curves, like the shape of an uncoiling fern leaf, or asked for the help of an older man or woman who was very good at drawing things to help them. This young man, though, was too proud of himself to ask for help, but he was not a very good artist. As a result, the tattoo that he made looked not like a man walking with a bear, but like a very ugly porcupine leaning up against a dead tree. That's too bad. One day, before he became known as Grabber, that young man had decided that he would do something which no one else in the village had ever done. He would have a bear cub as a pet. So one fine spring day, he set out from the village toward the place where the bears lived to catch a bear cub. This is not a good idea, you guys. People shook their heads as they watched him go, but no one tried to stop him. It was widely accepted that one could never tell another person what they should or should not do. If they attempted to do something that they shouldn't, then they would learn soon enough why it was not a good thing to do. It was not unusual for people in their village to have one of the animals of the forest living with them in their lodge. It was so commonly done that such animals would even be tolerated by the people's dogs. Chicken, would you like a porcupine living with us? Would you take that? I don't think so, girl. Usually, those were orphan animals whose mothers had been killed in an accident or by a hunter. Such pets as raccoons and beaver were common and were regarded no longer as wild animals, but as members of the family. A beaver for a pet. Troublesome members of the family at times. Oh, troublesome. A bear, though, was a different story, and stealing a young cub from its mother was not something that was advisable to try. So when the young man, who wanted to be known as Walks with the Bears, set out to catch a bear cub one spring, everyone in the village watched him go and waited. They did not wait long. Elder brother, the son, had traveled only the width of 2 hands across the sky when that young man came running as fast as he could back into the village, his eyes wide with fright, his hands holding onto his backside. He was shouting as he ran, "The bear grabbed me! The bear grabbed me!" He did not stop when he reached the village, but ran right through it, right through the fields by the river and right to the river itself. Perhaps he intended to run across the river too, but the water did not hold him up. Several people who had followed him pulled him out of the water before he could drown. The back of his loincloth had been torn by the swipe of a bear's claws, and there were some deep scratches on his backside, but he was not badly hurt. From that day on, though, that young man became known to everyone not as Walks with the Bears, but as Grabber. That's funny. I am a hungry, hungry bear, O'Quarry said as he listened to his stomach growling. As he walked down the rocky trail toward his canoe, which he had drawn up onto the alders at the edge of the river, he wondered what food might be ready so early in the morning. His thoughts were divided between his hunger and his memory of Grabber's story. He began to walk faster as he thought of food. He no longer considered the possibility of danger. By the time O'Quarry reached the place where the trail curved around a great stone to cross a rocky ledge, he was no longer watching where he put his feet. Suddenly, he heard a sound like pebbles being shaken into a hollow gourd. His heart leapt into his throat as he threw himself to one side to keep from stepping on a huge rattlesnake that was coiled in the middle of the trail. He landed hard on his shoulder. The rattlesnake was no more than an arm's length away from him, its tail a blur of motion. It lifted up its head and looked at him. O'Quarry did not move. The rattlesnake's eyes were bright as crystals as it moved its head back and forth, flicking out its tongue. Then, deciding this reckless young human was no real threat, it uncoiled itself and crawled off the trail, disappearing into the rocks. Phew. O'Quarry sat up slowly. My sister is right, he thought. I forget to think sometimes. I will try not to be so reckless from now on. He stood up and began to walk again down the trail. This time he watched where he stepped. As he walked, he rubbed his bruised shoulder. I have learned a lesson, he thought. Then he shook his head and sighed. By now, he thought, the pot of food in our lodge will be empty. I will have to wait until later in the day to eat. But when O'Quarry reached over his canoe, he saw two things. The first was a small basket made of birch bark filled with ripe strawberries. Oh, Tsitsia, he told himself, remembering that she had gone to pick berries at the same time he had left to build his new lodge. She must have crossed the river and placed these here for him before it grew dark last night. Thank you, my sister, he thought. He lifted up the berry basket and picked up the second thing in his canoe. It was a pouch that looked just like the one his Uncle Handtalker had worn on his waist. He sat down, placing the basket of berries at his side. Then he opened the drawstring of the pouch and shook out its contents into his lap. It was pemmican, smoked deer meat with maple sugar and dried blueberries pounded into it. Preserved by the maple sugar, food such as this would keep for a long, long time, and it was very good to eat. Thank you, my junior uncle, O'Quarry thought. Plucking a trembling leaf from a nearby alder, he took a few of the biggest berries and a pinch of the pemmican and placed them onto the leaf. Little people, O'Quarry said, I am happy to share this good food with you. He leaned over to place the leaf on the other side of the small alder's trunk so that the little people could come for their meal without being seen. He unhooked the bear-head drinking cup from his belt and went down on one knee to the wide river. He leaned over where the rocks made a small pool at the river's edge and dipped his cup under the surface to get the cold, clean water near the bottom. Then, feeling happy inside despite his bruised shoulder, O'Quarry sat back to enjoy his morning meal. That's the end of part 1. Next we'll start part 2, The Defender. Chicken, come say goodbye, girl. You say goodbye to the kids? Okay, say bye-bye. She's a dog. She doesn't talk. Okay, bye, guys.